The Australian bush, why does the idea of it continue to loom large in our national identity and imagination when fewer and fewer of us have any direct contact with it? To explore the meaning, mythology and unique place of the bush in Australian culture, we're joined by Don Watson, perhaps best known as Paul Keating's former speechwriter. Don discusses and reads from his most recent book, The Bush, Travels in the Heart of Australia. And Tim Lowe, botanist, zoologist and environmental consultant. He's also the author of Where the Song Began, Australia's Birds and How They Changed the World. Let's head off now to the Byron Bay Writers' Festival to see how the bush is faring and whether we need a national project to restore and rejuvenate it. Your moderator for this conversation is RN's Environment Editor, Greg Borschmann.
Don Watson, the bush. Do we have a definitional problem here? What is the bush? Scrub, malleelands or anything back of Burke?
All those things and a lot more, I suppose. It's also the what's in our heads. I mean, the more you look at it, the more it becomes impossible, as I discovered trying to write that bloody book. In fact, the best definition I had was from a CSIRO scientist who said, think of it as matter moving about. It didn't help me really, but it was a good definition. And
I thought trees didn't move.
Well, they do, of course, as the soil does. I'd never heard, for instance, of what was known as the scrub problem towards the end of the 19th century, where much of central western New South Wales was covered with scrub that had never grown there before, because the soils had been dislodged and they just washed. So all that idea about the movement of water and the effect on soils and so on does tend to bear that idea out that this is it's a place particularly since Europeans, it's a place where things are constantly moving and you can't really, whatever you're looking at now almost certainly wasn't there not very long ago. So there's that, plus the fact that the experience of these places, farming in these places or living there by one means or another, is profoundly different. If you grew up in South Gippsland where I did, it is nothing like growing up in the Mallee or the Riverina or North Queensland or Western Australia or whatever.
Tim Lowe, many different bushes. Where or what is your bush? And I wouldn't mind betting that there's a bush lime growing on it too.
Taking the cue from Don about the bush as that stuff out there, I feel that our culture is incredibly powerful. The media, newspapers, TV, it's all people looking at people. We're essentially looking at mirrors on ourselves. But that if you go beyond that world of cultural media, there's all these other species out there that have their own agendas. And to me, that's what the bush is. It's all that, the plants and the animals. And we can't talk to them, but we can go in there and try and understand what on earth is going on there. And we need to have that understanding because obviously we're not managing the Australian landscape very well, and that the key to getting that better management is getting some understanding of what is actually going on in the bush or what's left of it.
Don Watson, you've just talked about your book, a tome, dare we call it, not quite a biblical canon, but close enough. Let's set the scene. The very first page, the very first paragraph of your book, and I love the way it started on page 1.
Yes, well, it starts. The second word in this book is misspelt, which is. I don't mean it's misspelt. I mean the word is misspelt. Fuchsia has been corrected in the second edition. And the fuchsia turns up here. I remember my mother's father in a tattered hat and trousers tucked in his rubber boots, striding like Hiawatha across the paddock from his cowshed. I remember her mother sweeping. He strode, she swept. She swept as if not to sweep might let the devil onto the back veranda. Every morning she beat the gum leaves and cypress debris from those boards, and then from the steps that ran down to the garden and the path that led past the vegetables and the currant bushes and the lucerne tree that blocked out a view of the milking shed and the pig pen, one side of which was a fallen tree trunk. and onto the back gate, the wood heap and the lavatory in the shade of the cypresses, a grim watchtower with a bench seat of well-worn planks from which one could see through the cracks in the door to the chopping block, the place where the old house had been before the great bushfires of 1898, and the distant blue-green hills. Everywhere she wielded the broom with elbow grease and grim purpose. The back veranda was her frontier, those steps, the ramparts of her civilisation.
Don Watson, yeah, look, it's that for me gave me such a strong sense of an Australia that we did have. Don Watson, why did you resist so strongly for so long writing autobiographically in the first person?
Oh, well, I haven't got much super, and I thought I was saving it up for the old folks' home, you know. I thought I could dictate my memoirs to a nurse or something while with a rug over my knees. But I found it was the only way I couldn't get started on this any other way. So I really started with a gum leaf, those gum leaves that won't move, you know, and her beating it with a broom, which leads on to why gum leaves are like that. And that's what broke my resistance to writing autobiographically.
You say the bush is part of our founding myth. What do you mean? Is that part of the problem?
Part of the problem? Well, I think the bush is a bit of a problem for us, really. We have this sort of the national mythology of the bush, and it keeps us with a sort of back leg in an old place when we probably should be thinking about something else. I mean, I suppose the thing, the difference is with, say, the United States is that they retain the frontier mythology, but they ignore it in those places where life is being made. You know, you won't get a real good conversation going on the frontier legend in New York, but you might get it somewhere in the Midwest. Whereas here, it has this sort of sacred quality, which is fine, and would be much finer if we actually treated the bush with some kind of respect, or with some signs of the love that we profess for it, which we don't, and if we showed some understanding of it, which we don't have, and we rely on people like Tim for.
How much did the Heidelberg School of Painting simply get it wrong? The bush wasn't a very romantic place. You paint a picture of little ease or respite, generations of unrelenting toil and material poverty, at least as far as your family was concerned.
Well, yes and no. I mean, so I also say that, you know, from what I could see, my mother's family was sort of pioneers in this mountain ash forest. I think they had the best time of it, really. I think that first generation, I mean, it's a marvellous thing to be doing, to be actually creating a new life in a new world. And once they burned the hell out of the place, they were sitting on soils that just they could grow anything in them. So they actually had very good lives within 25 years of, you know, they had cricket and football and bridge and tap dancing and God knows what, you know, in the local mechanics hall, and they had a school and they were eating raspberries and cream every day. Everything was lovely. But really it was the hard part was really for the generation after that, who had the weeds and the feral pests and the depression and the war and all the rest of it. And I mean, again, it depends. I mean, it's like the bush being a multifarious place. Some people were lucky. Their farms happened to be where there was plenty of sunshine, and they were on the right side of the hill, and the soil was okay, and there was water. And some people were in hell and couldn't make a go.
Tim Lowe, were you a bush baby? How much is that now firmly embedded in your DNA?
I grew up in suburban Brisbane. It was a very banal area. There was no bush whatsoever. People seem to assume that I must have grown up in the bush, that I must have had parents who are naturalists. I'm not sure where it came from. I assume it was my mother when I was very young. Must have said, "Look at that birdie," and I just looked and I've never stopped looking. I mean, not necessarily at birds, but things that were alive, but they weren't us. And I just think that's endlessly fascinating.
Can you remember when that happened?
No, in fact, I don't have any memory of it. It's just that I've been a naturalist since early childhood, but grew up in the boring northern suburbs of Brisbane where there was no bush.
Was it snakes, reptiles, birds?
I mean, there was dinosaurs, then butterflies. I was collecting fossils, rocks, skulls. My father, we had one of those high classic Queenslander houses, and he made a room under the house, put beach sand to cover that black, damp dirt, and I had sheep skulls and snakes in jars and shells and fossils and insects. I had live snakes, and they would get out, and a neighbour reported me to the police, and I was crying when the council came and took my snakes away.
Explains a lot, doesn't it? Look, is Don Watson right and wrong? I mean, the bush, a sentimental place, a deeply emotional place, but also capable of rewiring the brain. It happens to you after you spend time out of the big smoke, weeks, months at a time on a patch of bush southwest of Brisbane. What happened?
Yeah, well, I was telling you that story, how I always have my car radio on Radio National, and that as I'm driving around Brisbane, it sounds really good. But then when I've been in the bush for a couple of weeks, turn on the car, Radio National comes on, it's just jarring and jangling. It's vexatious to the spirit. And you think, how can it go from being so good to so bad? And you realise...
That's not a very good promo for us, Tim, really.
And you realise that it's just that, you know, the sounds, the soundtrack you've been listening to has been the wind through the leaves, the birds, whether you know you've been listening to it or not, and that we are living stressful, fast-paced lives, that push to get ahead, to deal with all our worries, and that, you know, we are crammed into these cities, this coastal culture, and that the balm of nature, and I don't really want to romanticise it to a ridiculous extent, but, you know, you get out there, you can just breathe more deeply. That feeling doesn't come straight away, but a few days of that is very therapeutic, and I think it's a tragedy that most Australians have lost that connection.
You've written about the bush in your book, Where Song Began. You've chosen a reading for us?
I have. It doesn't quite fit the flavour of this conversation, but I suppose as a nature writer, I mean, you can hear me talking about, you know, like I love snakes and birds and things, but to actually try to convey that enjoyment to readers, I don't think I can do that through description. Like, I'm not a poet in the sense of saying the snake has beautiful scales and it moves like liquid. That's not my approach. So it is very much trying to say that there are stories in the landscape. If you know the story of that plant and that bird, then it is very exciting. So this paragraph, I'll let it speak for itself. When biologists compare Australia to the rest of the world, they sometimes emphasise the similarities by talking about Australia having its own versions of Northern Hemisphere robins, flycatchers and creepers, as if evolution walks the same walk everywhere. There is value in this, but the differences are more revealing. A reading of recent research shows that Australian birds are more likely than most to eat sweet foods, live in complex societies, lead long lives, attack other birds, and be intelligent and loud. The services they render to plants are sometimes exceptional. We've got honeyeaters and parrots that are globally exceptional as pollinators, pigeons and cassowaries unsurpassed at moving seeds. Australia is a land where the bird-plant interactions are especially strong. So the ornithologist Richard Shoddy was right to declare that the birds of Australia and New Guinea are the most distinct and different in the world.
It's a birthright that we should not forget. Don Watson, wishing. How much is this about modern day wishing? Like the Anzacs, as you alluded to before, lest we forget, the legend grows. The bush retains its sentimental symbolism, a metaphor for the way we wish we could be.
I don't know if this actually answers the question, but in the same way that I think Anzac is becoming increasingly a sort of maudlin pantomime, and we should think seriously about... I mean, when a bloke from SBS...
Were you going to say abolish it?
I'm tempted. No, when someone from SBS tweets something about, you know, as if it's contestable history and has sacked on the spot, and Malcolm Turnbull tweets outrageous. You think, what's going on? But that's another story. It is contestable history, for God's sake. But so also is Bush mythology. And I think, much as I said before, it would make more sense to me if we actually did something about regenerating the place and looking after it. I mean, so long as it's kept at some ritual lip service sort of way, and prime ministers can wear squatters' hats for 10 years and send the whole country into denial again. I mean, this is balmy. I mean, if we want to have a Bush mythology, well then, unpick it and start putting it back together again, which we just failed to do. And it's very hard to imagine in the present political culture any government coming up with the will to take that task seriously.
We will come back to that. It is one of the great national projects. You've said the bush is now mainly occupied by city commuters who don't even understand that it's rubbishy regrowth forest. No one worries about the blackberries and the broom and the foxes and the rabbits.
Well, I don't know how Tim manages, whose knowledge is infinitely greater than mine, but one of the problems with having an interest in these things is that you can't drive anywhere without... It's a bit like your mother in the garden, you can't look at the garden without seeing the weeds. If you see a host of golden daffodils, you see a thistle in it. They've got to get rid of that thistle rather than have those daffodils beautiful. So if you drive around, once you get a taste for it, all you can see is degeneration. You fail to see the beauty after a while. And really, to go and see the bush, you have to get off the road. You can sort of take it in, but a little knowledge in this case is a bit of a spoiler. You'd be in this, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. That you can look at something and say, well, that's all very lovely, but it shouldn't look like that. Yeah.
Before we started this conversation, I asked Tim Lowe to think about 3 species of native plants that tell us a story about the past and the future of Australia. Tim, I'm wondering what native species you chose.
Okay, the Tasmanian Waratah I find an incredibly exciting plant, much smaller than the famous Sydney Waratah. But we've got these fossil leaves that were found in Tasmania more than 20 million years old, that they're so fine that you can actually see the stomata, the actual pores through which the leaves transacted the gases, and they're indistinguishable from living Tasmanian Waratah. And then we found this pollen grain, or single pollen grain actually, found in the Latrobe coal measures in Victoria. It's from the Cretaceous, from the time of the dinosaurs, which is indistinguishable from Tasmanian Waratah pollen. It's found along with grevillea pollen, Adenanthus, a Western Australian wildflower, all in the same plant family. And I've looked at Tasmanian Waratah, I've licked the nectar, and I'm thinking, is this a Cretaceous drink? I wouldn't suggest that it's exactly the same plant that you had in the Cretaceous, but I talked to an expert on fossil pollen. She said, well, Tasmania, this is a place that's full of these ancient conifers and things. So I think in some parts of Australia, you've got incredible continuity with the past. And because it's red, really tough, hardy flowers, obviously designed for bird pollination. I think you can look at that and say that's evidence that there were birds pollinating flowers in Australia at the time of the dinosaurs. You still want 2 more plants? These are long spiels.
No, off you go. That's number 1. That's not bad. I'm wondering what you're going to do for number 2 and 3.
Well, you said old and new. So for new, I think I was in Arakwal National Park yesterday, and there's a pink-flowered native raspberry. It's a nice bush tucker plant. I've actually been out with the Arakwal elders here about 10 years ago when the land rights claim, the national park was created. I was brought in by New South Wales National Park to collect the traditional knowledge. It was a great honour to be part of that, wonderful to be back. But this raspberry, it's found in temperate Australia and it reappears in China, Japan. And how can the same plant be in 2 places? And I think this is Japanese snipe. So we have these birds breeding in Japan, used to breed on Mount Fuji, breed part of the Russian archipelago. They fly to Australia to escape those northern winters. They've never been seen stopping on the way in Southeast Asia. They don't land on the sea. They're not a marine bird. And so I think that a lot of the plants that we have, which are either the same species or closely related to Northern Hemisphere plants, it's been migratory waders bringing them. So I think it is so exciting to look at a plant and think that this same plant is growing in China, and that and in fact I've actually flushed a snipe from right beside one of these raspberries.
We're not going to let him get away with not telling us another story.
Spinifex. It's you think of Australia old and new, so the Australian continent breaks off from Gondwana, it drifts north into the dry middle latitudes, so we dry out, the rainforest shrinks back to the coast, out in the centre deserts are forming. There's winners and losers being created from this, so the old rainforest plants, they're shrinking back to the coast, but then there's new opportunities created for anything that can handle these barren open landscapes. Spinifex, more than anything, has been this amazing success story. A grass that is functionally a shrub, those prickly big clumps, wonderful for biodiversity. Inside those clumps, you've got special birds, Spinifex bird that you see one, just dives straight into the Spinifex. Grass wrens, they just run straight in, but if you try and get in, you just get spiked. There are mammals that live in them, lizards, insects. That's just part of the story. Spinifex is spreading, and it spreads with fire. I mean, these things go up like a bomb if you burn them. I had this teenage experience. I was about 18 or 19. I caught a train up to Mount Isa. I was in my lizard catching phase. Saw a lizard run into a clump. And of course, I couldn't get it out. I wanted that lizard. So I put a match in. Now, I'd actually been a little bit cautious in making sure that it wasn't close to other clumps, but that Spinifex, it just exploded. There's no way that lizard could have gotten out. And I think the way Spinifex is spreading is by spreading fire. Like, it'll burn, eat into the mulga and the other habitats, and Spinifex comes back. So these fire-adapted native grasses, the extent to which they've pushed back the rainforest, it's quite an amazing story.
What I love about those stories is not just the stories, but the passion that he tells it with. I just don't know how he got his hands around the microphone. Don, your turn, because you have a story of red cedar in your book, and it's. I think most people are familiar with the story of red cedar, but the way you tell it peeled the scales from my eyes.
Well, there'll be people here who are more familiar with it than I am. It's a very local plant. Tunis ciliata is a straight-trunked deciduous tree of the eastern coastal rainforest from Ulladulla, south of Sydney, to the McIlwraith Range on the Cape York Peninsula. It averages 40 metres and will grow to more than 50 if conditions are ideal. Red cedar is endemic to New Guinea and parts of Burma, southern China, India and Pakistan. The North American tree of the same name is a different species. We've got Tim sitting here. I'm terrified that I've got all this wrong. He'll be thinking, oh yeah. These days you will struggle to find a living example of an Australian red cedar outside half a dozen major public gardens. However, dead ones abound. In the Sydney Town Hall, for example, the interior of this mid-19th century monster, by turns French Second Empire, Italian Renaissance, Jacobean and English aesthetic in style, swallowed an unknown number of red cedars from the Hawkesbury river stands. As the material of choice among mid-Victorian designers of public buildings, unpainted red cedar turns up in the walls or furnishings of town halls, parliaments, post offices, churches, libraries, courthouses and railway stations built on the eastern seaboard before 1880. Being strong, light, durable and easily carved and turned, it was put to use in house frames and picture frames, interior panelling in trams and railway carriages, staircases, doors, floors, ceilings, shutters, window sashes, skirting boards, carved mantelpieces, veneers, boats, cigar boxes, fine furniture and coffins. That's what happened to red cedar.
Tim Lowe, red cedar was found in the Big Scrub. You've got a story about the Big Scrub.
My interest in the Big Scrub is particularly in the role of pigeons and other birds in spreading the seeds. So if you think of the Pleistocene, these big ice ages that came and went, that at the peak of an ice age it was very, very arid. The rainforest would have shrunk back to these tiny areas. Then when the climate became warmer and wetter, birds would have helped bring the rainforest back out by eating the seeds and digesting them. I mean, it's very clear in the big scrub that there were cassowaries there not very long ago, that we had this whole series of large rainforest trees with large fruits, nearly all of which are quite rare, Durobi, Hickspethia and so on. And they're rare because the rainforest shrank back in an ice age and the cassowaries weren't there anymore, either because they got too small for them or possibly because of indigenous hunting. We really don't know. We don't have much fossil evidence of them. But anyway, this is actually about the top-knot pigeons, which were the most common of the fruit-eating birds there. And I talked about how there used to be these giant flocks. So I talked about how I used to stay in a cabin near Mount Warning. Some mornings in a succession of flocks, more than 1,000 would pass by. From hillside roosts, they would hurtle down the narrow valley towards fruit trees below. Some flocks, hugging the canopy, looked like the shadows of clouds racing over the land. Their wings brought an unsettling roar that sounded as if the roof were lifting off. Groups flying higher recalled the sound of fast fluttering flags. Distant flocks came to my ears like a wave on its long roll to the beach or an old car on a gravel road. Groups that loafed in trees, spraying seeds down on quickly discolouring leaves, brought to mind intermittent rain. The largest flock I saw held 120 birds. I could only wonder about the sounds made in times past when flocks of 3,000 went past. Their reign ended when the pioneers brought down the big scrub, Australia's largest subtropical rainforest, etc.
John Watson, you don't see this merely as resource exploitation. You describe it as part of the whole colonial project. What do you mean?
Not sure. To unwind. Oh yes, with the cedar, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it was sort of it was our mahogany. You see, it was, and mahogany was a status wood, So somehow getting that cedar and putting it in the finer homes and even in the trams and what have you really was proof of civilization in a way that a bit of blue gum wouldn't be. You know what I mean? So it was
the proper place for it.
It was the proper place for it, and it was as if we had our own, like a cricket team and other things. I think, as I recall, that's what I meant by that paragraph that you've plucked out of the book and landed me with.
Here's another one. You talk about...
Thanks.
This doesn't come from the book. It came from an interview that you did not so long ago, and you talked about the clearing and the burning and the intensive grazing. Actually, this does come from the book. putting paid to ancient ecosystems and that forever changed the look of the land. That's very easy to say, but I'm just wondering, what does it do to your heart to know that, your mind, your muscle memory, as you called it? I thought that was a fascinating phrase, your muscle memory.
Yeah, well, it's sort of it's a bit like I was saying before. If you don't know that this used to be something else, well, you're probably leading a fortunate life. The more you know about what
you're not grieving.
Yeah, the more you know about what it was and how much damage has been done, and the more descriptions you read of the beauties of the thing and the wonders of it, then the more you are going to grieve and the less happy you will be getting around in it. And I actually think, I said this earlier today, that there is a strong... There's a kind of fork in the road of our consciousness with the bush, and one fork leads to what might be a kind of unbearable melancholy, a sort of remorse. It's funny, this sounds completely berserk, but I remember living in Tokyo for a while and thinking the Japanese are sort of constructed now in such a way, if they look back, they go crazy. They'd end up like the Argentinians, getting around, singing sad songs. They can't afford to look back. They just put everything to the sword, as it were. And I think we do a bit of the same as far as the bush is concerned.
How much, then, is this a story that we haven't come to terms with for other reasons? You wrote an entire book about this, your first book, Caledonia Australis, Scottish Highlanders on the Frontier of Australia. It wasn't just rolling back the bush, but it was also eliminating that ancient black civilization that went before it.
Yeah, well, that's we've been in denial for most of the time since the first shot was fired, really, and that we went back into it as recently as 1996 seems to me bizarre and strange, as if our masters think that we can't carry some kind of confidence about ourselves and some regret without falling apart. Strikes me as very odd, as if we can't possibly be the sum of our failings as well as our successes. That's bonkers, and I don't think it does us much service thinking this way. The thing about, in looking at this, I thought I knew about the frontier, but I looked at the East Gippsland frontier years ago, which was bad enough. But the more I looked this time, the more atrocious it became, I'm afraid.
Tim Lowe, the historian Henry Reynolds has pointed to this problem, the whispering in the bottom of our hearts. It was a phrase first used in 1842 by parliamentarian and barrister Richard Windeyer to justify the argument that the blacks had no right to the soil of Australia. We think differently now, but how much does this debate colour or frame what you do, the way that you imagine the ecology of Australia?
That's a very interesting and actually a difficult question, because I think it's Bill Gamage who's really pushed that debate. So his argument that the whole of Australia is an Aboriginal estate, that every square metre was managed. If you do take it to that extent, it is basically denying nature, that it's all a parkland, it isn't nature. And he's a beautiful writer, and certainly you can't deny the central thesis that Australia was a strongly managed land. But I really think it's overkill that he takes it too far, and that this whole argument that you get through Marcia Langton, Tim Flannery, a whole series of academics, that the Australian landscape is an artefact, that you can have a strong human influence, but that doesn't mean that nature, therefore, isn't really there. And so I think we tend to simplify things so much, this kind of dualistic thinking, it's either one or the other, and that we probably haven't had that debate. That Bill Gamage's book has been amazingly influential, and I think now the next stage is for the naturalists to define what does nature mean in a landscape where there was a huge amount of human management going back tens of thousands of years.
I think I see Tim's next book.
No.
The Last Lyrebird. Don Watson, you grew up on 147 acres. I have no idea how many hectares that is. In East Gippsland. Many of them vertical, as you put it. Tell us about the Gully and the Last Lyrebird.
Well, the lyrebirds are all gone by the time we got to this part of the Strzelecki Ranges, but the part that we came from, 40 miles away, there was still the odd lyrebird around into the 1930s. And this is a story I've told so often. But anyway, they'd left some of the gullies, the settlers, but they were cleared in the Depression because the local paper mill, which had just set up, offered some money for the mountain ash in the gullies. And of course they took the whole lot to their horror, and that was the end of the lyrebirds completely. So it's a story my mother told many times. But if I may, while we're on lyrebirds, there is that they are miraculous creatures. And the story I loved was one which I think was somewhere in this general part of the continent, which was singing a 1930s song in the 1960s. Do you know this story? And one of them they figured that one had been taken, a man had captured one and kept it, and it listened to the radio, which was playing this, or the wireless as we would have called it. It had heard this, and he'd re-released it, and it had passed it on to its descendants. And so if you wanted to hear this old 1930s hit song, you could go out and listen to it in the bush in the 1960s. And it's probably still, another descendant is singing it now.
Well, Tasmanian whipbirds, I don't know if they still do it, but it's the same story, that they were introduced to Tasmania from the mainland, and they were, not whipbirds, lyrebirds. So lyrebirds were taken to Tasmania, and they were imitating whipbirds, which are not found in Tasmania, for decades.
Right.
So the reason it's happening is that a young lyrebird will listen to its father, to the other males, and so it's a perfect example of cultural transmission in birds. I think it's one of the exciting things about birds as a topic, that traditionally had the idea that when intelligence was noticed in chimpanzees and dolphins, so there was this big push of research into understanding animal intelligence, birds were left out of that until very, very recently. And now we find that parrots, the big songbirds, particularly the big Australian songbirds, extremely intelligent. And so now there is all this sort of catch-up game going on to understand. But yeah, this what Don's talking about, it's culturing birds.
20 years after those last lyrebirds disappeared from East Gippsland, 1955, Victoria's Sherbrooke Forest. You have an interesting story to tell about a couple of famous visitors to that place. Why on earth were they going there, and what were they looking for?
I don't think Australians realise the extent to which there was a kind of lyrebird mania. I mean, lyrebirds became really big in Australia, and these days if you say, what's our favourite animal? It's the koala. But there was a time before that when it was the lyrebird. And so Audrey Hepburn, Robert Helpman, going there to listen to them. So Audrey Hepburn talking in her biography about how sexy the lyrebird was, how just this amazing experience. And you can find this writers all over the world saying that the lyrebird was the world's best songbird. Now, it could sound like I'm being chauvinistic in saying that, but now that the internet makes it so easy, I'll say to all of you, it's very easy to go on YouTube and play the nightingale, the bird that by public acclaim is the best songster in Europe. Listen to a nightingale, enjoy it, be totally entranced by it, and then go and play a lyrebird. And you're left with the impression that the nightingale was just the warm-up act.
A friend of mine was riding his bicycle down a hill in the Baw Baw Ranges, and he came upon a lyrebird that had just been killed by a car. And he thought, well, to honour the bird, I should get the feathers out of its tail. I've always, I'll take home the feathers. And when the next car came around the corner, he had his foot on its neck and he was trying to pull the feathers out of it, which wasn't a good look, as you could imagine. The horror on their faces as they passed, he said, was really something.
Don Watson, we will return to your great national project of regenerating this land, but just for the moment I'd like to get a reflection from Tim Lowe on that Sherbrooke Forest, because it's now corralled by suburban Melbourne with all the management and mismanagement issues that entails, from weeds to feral cats. What's the story of that place now, and in some ways the unlikely survival of lyrebirds in that little remnant?
Well, I think Australians are very good at intensive management. It's amazing the number of little bushland sites that are propped up with enormous human resources. And there's certainly a mismatch in Australia where the people get the best attention. So Victoria is a pretty good state to be if you're a rare plant or animal. I mean, the enormous investment that goes, for example, into the helmeted honeyeater in Yellingbo Forest near Melbourne, where I was recently, propping up what is an endangered subspecies. You can go to North Queensland, buff-breasted putton quail, a whole species. It's never been photographed. There's a recovery plan, and it says these are all the things to do. None of them are being done. So I think that with Sherbrooke Forest, because it is so important to our history, because the lyrebird is very iconic, the problems now include sambar deer moving in, degrading it, massive weed problems.
Into Sherbrooke Forest?
Yes.
Sambar deer?
Yes. they're slipping through all over the place. There's an explosion.
We should tell the shooters party, shouldn't we? I mean, goodness gracious.
It's the shooters that move them around a lot of the time. Not necessarily the shooters party, but there's a lot of movement of deer into forests that don't have them, so there's something to come back to. But yeah, so I think I can't answer your question specifically about the fate of Sherbrooke Forest, but I know that you can actually see it here in Arakwal as an endangered clay heath. I went out with an Indigenous ranger just a couple of days ago, and just the intensive management you can get where you have a sympathetic community on the edge of a forest. And some cases I'd say, look, just shift our gaze away and don't neglect the places way out west where you don't have this large empathetic community close by to put in the human resources and to keep an eye on what's actually going on.
Don Watson, I'd like to talk to you about the symbols of the bush. When you were a speechwriter for Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, Keating was very much a champion for a new and distinctly Australian flag. A few years earlier, in 1984, when visiting Canada, the Canadian government had decked out Ottawa with New Zealand flags in Hawkeye's honour. Clearly, Keating didn't want that to happen to him.
Yeah, well, again, I talked about this earlier today. I'm a bit conscious there may be people here who think he's only got two stories. But, yes, well, he didn't like... He's got that bit of rag in the corner. And he wouldn't fly it on the car, of course. He wouldn't. The idea of standing in front of 7 Australian flags like they do now was unspeakable to him. But it caused great convulsions across the country when he went on West Australian radio and said he wouldn't. It was actually a bit of a distraction, or so the more worldly members of the gallery thought. So I don't want the flag. No, get a new flag. They went berserk. I had no idea it was going to happen. And anyway, these school teachers sent in lots of designs of flags, none of which described anything resembling urban life. There wasn't a building or a human being apart from 2 that had Bob Hawke in them. And even then, in one he was in a gum tree and in the other he was standing on a Uluru. And they were all about the bush. So there is this strange thing that while we cling to the coastal fringe and live urban lives, we imagine Australia as being a physical landscape, and that we must then, I presume, think that we are part of it, which is the essential contradiction, because we don't act as if we are.
Let's finish with Don Watson's grand national project. You're very clear about what we've lost. 92% of our old growth forests, landscapes that are degraded, not as productive, exhausted, as you put it. But you speak of this great national project for the next 100 years, the next 10 generations. What is it more precisely? Are you dreaming?
Yeah. Hoping, well, I don't. There's no point sort of wondering if it's possible. There's no point wondering if a modern Australian government could actually decide that this was going to be a great project of regeneration. But it won't happen without that happening. Now, what's odd is that the destruction was heavily subsidised, massively subsidised. It was largely done by closer settlement programs, which were subsidised to the hilt. Where everybody who went on to this land, good or bad, was meant to improve it, was compelled to improve it, and improvement meant one thing: clearing it. So it's not as if this all happened by some accident. It was government-sponsored destruction, and it seems reasonable that government should sponsor its regeneration instead of leaving it to a few corporate. But that would mean, of course, that we have to agree to it, and as we can't agree to a carbon tax or anything else, we probably won't agree to this. But again, if we're meant to love the bush and count it as part of ourselves, well, then you'd think that we would agree to it. But every time, we talked about environment taxes. The Treasury preferred to call them hypothecated somethings and tax. but they get shoved aside. I mean, I think the other thing that you need to say is, well, there was phenomenal effort went into the destruction. I mean, so it's reasonable to suppose that the same kind of effort would have to go into its regeneration. But probably less so because, we now have a science of we understand it a lot better than they did. We do know how it works more than we used to.
Tim Lowe, we already have the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, restoring and reconnecting habitat along the entire 3,600 kilometre length of the Great Dividing Range. Pew Trusts have an Outback Australia project to restore one of the great large-scale natural regions left on Earth. Are we already doing what Don Watson dreams about?
I do have a problem with the visionary approaches like the Great Eastern Ranges, the Threatened Species Summit, let's kill 2 million cats. To mobilise public interest, we tend to get this great simplification. Let's find the biggest problem and throw everything into that. So I think with the kill 2 million cats, the Great Eastern Ranges, there's a lot to be gained from those, but there are species everywhere, there are problems everywhere. So I think these sort of grand narrative, like overarching programs are not really, Don's talked about the weed and pest problems. I mean, there are people trying to save an endangered orchid right here. So I think that conservation is something that it really can't be a top-down vision thing. I mean, the visions obviously have a place.
It's your backyard.
It's at every level, every kind of social grouping, every tier of government, every kind of organisation level. It's got to be diffuse. It's got to be complicated. And really what I'm about is just trying to increase the ecological IQ, make ecology so exciting that we sort of lift sort of ecological awareness so that people can see there's a weed problem right there. I'm just going to go and pull a few things out, and that we all sort of put our shoulders to the wheel, and we enjoy doing it because it's beautiful.
You're a direct action man, I can see.
Not only, but yeah, there's a lot of work to do.
We've talked a lot about a human perspective on the bush today, but Tim Lowe, I'm wondering what the glossy black cockatoo, the emu wren, and the orange-bellied parrot tell us about the bush. What would their report card look like? The glossy-tailed black cockatoo, the emu wren, and the orange-bellied parrot.
Well, the orange-bellied parrot's nearly gone, so we've got about 60 left in the wild. So they're going to be... The report card's really unhappy. I'm actually privileged that I got to see some in the wild because they'll be extinct in the wild probably in the next few years. This was at Werribee Sewage Farm, and I was in my underpants because I had to wade through a deep pool to get to where they were over there. But yeah, no, they're pretty well a basket case. Glossy black cockatoos, they're spread over quite a large area of Australia in low numbers. I think they're okay. I mean, we've actually got 3 species of emu wren. The Mallee emu wren is doing really, really badly because you get these hot fires in spinifex, which will be worse because of climate change. And you've got these little pockets of them here and there, and you've got some people saying we need to create corridors so that they can move between these little pockets. And then you've got other people saying, but hold on, if you create a corridor of spinifex, won't the fires just burn from one end to the other? So there's a real management conundrum. I mean, saving species is tough, we're really up against the wall.
Don Watson, a final reflection? Is it all about money?
No, it's not. I don't think it is at all. I mean, I think the grand vision, insofar as I have one, it is really about the regeneration of farmland. I mean, is what I'm really thinking about. But and you may get some kind of consensus opinion on that because farmers are aware of falling productivity and how they're not going to be there in another generation. So there's that. You have some kind of
common ground,
some kind of gravity to it. But no, I mean there are. In the midst of all this, there are these sort of amazing little signs. Like I thought it was fantastic a few years ago when they closed the Hume Highway in northeastern Victoria to build little bridges for possums to cross. I thought, well, they closed it for 24 hours. That was pretty fantastic, so little ringtails can go shooting across. It may not have been ringtails, which are as common as mice, but you know, there are these powerful little efforts, often very local ones, that makes you think, well, there is some kind of feeling for these creatures in the community. I mean, you know, after the Black Saturday fires, that koala, was it a koala or a kangaroo that wandered up and asked for help? That was pretty touching. And, you know, I mean, there is a sort of empathetic feeling about it, but it's not triggered very often. And I also don't think it's particularly useful if it's not allied somehow to scientific understanding, which is where Tim comes in.
What do we lose? This is a final question to both of you. What do we lose if we lose the bush?
Tim?
Well, we can't lose the bush. I mean, Australia's a big land with 20-something million people. There'll always be bush out there. It's just a question of how messed up and degraded it is. I mean, I think you can get really depressed and bleak about these things, and you ask me about some rare birds, but I mean, one of the things that inspires me about Australia is that we have so many really successful birds that, you know, the cockatoos, the lorikeets, they're among us. And I mean, this in fact is part of the problem in selling the conservation crisis, that when you get up and say, oh, the birds are dying out, people say, what are you talking about? There's birds everywhere. It's noisy. I get woken up at dawn, you know. And so I think that we won't lose the bush. It is just that the composition is changing, and that what the moral quest for us is, the ones that are slipping away from us, is to not let them go and just let the successful subset fill their places. That is a diminished Australia, that we want to keep them all because we're the only continent that's got these amazing things, and this global obligation to keep them. And I do disagree with Don when he said it's not about money. I think it is often about money, that when all the government departments put in their budget requests, when Treasury goes through, they always slash the Environment Department budgets heavily, and the things they don't do are sometimes just unbelievable. And you say, why aren't you doing this? And they say, we just haven't got the budget for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, a vision for the future, a vision for the bush. Could you please thank Don Watson and Tim Loeb